Most people have no idea that some of the most precise gut health science being published today was already written down thousands of years ago, not as nutrition advice, but as agriculture, ritual, and daily diet. The Bible doesn't read like a wellness book, but when modern microbiome researchers isolate the specific foods named throughout Scripture, particularly the 7 species listed by God Himself in Deuteronomy 8:8, something remarkable happens. These foods aren't just historically significant. They are, compound for compound, doing exactly what the most advanced gut health research says we should be eating right now. Today we're breaking down 12 of them. Stay with us, because number 5 on this list contains a compound so specific that researchers had to identify the exact strain of gut bacteria required to unlock it. And number 1 is the fruit so important to ancient civilization that it was carved 200 times into the pillars of Solomon's temple, and modern science has spent decades trying to fully understand why. 12 foods, thousands of years of evidence. Let's get into it. Before we dive in, one honest note. Archaeological and skeletal research on the ancient Israelite period actually shows real nutritional gaps, including notable rates of iron deficiency anemia, largely because daily life depended so heavily on flatbread without consistent vegetables or meat. This isn't a perfect diet myth. What's remarkable is that despite those gaps, the specific foods Scripture singles out by name turn out to be exactly the foods modern microbiome science independently identifies as the most powerful tools we have for gut health. The ancient world wasn't eating perfectly, but what they were eating, when they had it, was extraordinarily well chosen. Number 12, barley. The grain with the only FDA-approved heart claim. Barley is one of the oldest domesticated crops of the entire Fertile Crescent, and its value comes down to one specific compound, mixed linkage beta-glucan. This is a soluble fiber that your body cannot digest in the small intestine. It survives all the way down into the colon completely intact, where your gut bacteria take over. Clinical trials have found that consuming high molecular weight barley beta-glucan significantly increases the abundance of Bacteroidetes bacteria in the gut, while decreasing firmicutes, a shift that researchers have linked to leaner, lower inflammation gut profiles. As that fiber ferments, it produces short-chain fatty acids, the same compounds your gut uses to signal satiety and regulate insulin sensitivity through specific receptors on your intestinal cells. At the same time, barley fiber forms a thick gel along your gut lining that physically slows glucose absorption, which is why food manufacturers are legally permitted to print heart health claims directly on barley products. This is the exact grain used to feed the 5,000 in the Gospel of John. Not wheat, barley. The grain of ordinary people turns out to be one of the most clinically validated grains on the planet. Number 11, sprouted grains. The Ezekiel bread that pre-digests itself. Ezekiel chapter 4 verse 9 describes a specific bread made from wheat, barley, millet, spelt, lentils, and soybeans combined together. When these seeds are sprouted before baking, something genuinely sophisticated happens at the molecular level. Sprouting activates enzymes called phytases, which break down phytic acid, the compound that normally blocks your body from absorbing iron, zinc, magnesium, and calcium. Given what we just discussed about ancient anemia rates, this detail matters enormously. Sprouting also begins pre-digesting the starches and proteins in the grain, cleaving them into amino acids your body can use directly, while significantly reducing the immunogenic proteins responsible for triggering gut inflammation in sensitive individuals. The result is bread with a glycemic index around 36, remarkably low, that delivers roughly 3 grams of fiber per slice. Fiber that binds to bile acids and forces your liver to pull LDL cholesterol out of circulation to make more. Number 10, pomegranate. The fruit that becomes medicine only inside your gut. The pomegranate is one of the 7 species named directly in Deuteronomy, and researchers have spent decades trying to understand exactly why it carries the biological power it does. The answer lies in a compound called punicolagen, found mostly in the peel and juice. Here's what makes this remarkable. Punicolagen on its own barely gets absorbed by your body. It travels almost entirely intact down into your colon, where a very specific strain of gut bacteria, Bifidobacterium pseudocatenulatum, metabolizes it into a completely different compound called urolithin A. This transformed compound is what actually enters your bloodstream and goes to work, activating pathways that strengthen the literal protein structures holding your intestinal wall together, the same proteins that prevent inflammatory compounds from leaking out of your gut and into your bloodstream. The pomegranate isn't medicine by itself. It becomes medicine because of what your own gut bacteria do to it. Number 9. Figs. The fruit that thickens your gut lining from the inside. When King Hezekiah was dying from a severe infection, the prophet Isaiah didn't just pray. He ordered a paste of figs pressed directly onto the wound, and the king recovered. That detail in 2 Kings turns out to be biochemically precise. Figs contain phycin, an enzyme that breaks down damaged tissue, alongside compounds with documented antimicrobial activity. But internally, figs do something equally remarkable. Studies on fig paste have found it causes measurable thickening of the colon's mucus-producing crypt cells, meaning your gut literally builds a thicker protective lining when figs are part of your regular diet. In clinical trials, a daily intake of roughly 3 to 4 figs significantly reduced colonic transit time and nearly doubled the weekly frequency of normal bowel movements, converting hard, dehydrated stool into a healthy, well-formed consistency without the cramping or dependency that comes with synthetic laxatives. There's something about this kind of patient, consistent food wisdom that reminds me of my mother's friend, a woman from a small village who never had a refrigerator growing up and built her entire week's eating around what was dried, fermented, or freshly picked. She kept a small clay jar of dried figs on her kitchen counter her whole life, and every single day, without fail, she'd eat a small handful before her main meal. She never called it digestive support. She just called it settling the stomach before you fill it. She lived into her late 80s with remarkably few digestive complaints her entire life, and learning what researchers have actually found inside figs, I finally understand the biology behind something she simply knew through decades of paying attention. Number 8. Olive oil, the compound that behaves like ibuprofen. Olive oil appears throughout Scripture not as a flavoring, but as medicine, fuel, and sacred substance. The compound responsible is oleocanthal, a polyphenol, researchers have found, inhibits the exact same inflammatory pathway that ibuprofen targets, without the stomach irritation. But here's the detail most people miss. Around 90 to 95% of olive oil's beneficial polyphenols travel directly to your colon rather than being absorbed earlier in digestion. Once there, your gut bacteria, specifically lactobacillus and bifidobacterium species, convert oleuropein into its most active form, hydroxytyrosol. This compound activates a cellular pathway called NRF2, which boosts your gut's own internal antioxidant production, while measurably lowering inflammatory markers like C-reactive protein. Olive oil even selectively kills harmful bacteria like E. coli and salmonella while leaving your beneficial gut bacteria completely untouched. Number 7. Grapes, the fruit that triggers a specific bacterial bloom. The vine is one of the most repeated images in all of Scripture, and modern research explains exactly why ancient people kept returning to it. Grape polyphenols, particularly compounds called proanthocyanidins, travel down into the colon, where they trigger a dramatic, reproducible bloom of a bacterium called Akkermansia muciniphila, which in a healthy gut can make up 3 to 5% of your entire microbiome. This specific bacterium lives in your gut's mucus layer and plays a critical role in keeping inflammatory bacterial components from leaking into your bloodstream. Research has found that grape polyphenols measurably lower circulating inflammatory markers like interleukin-6, specifically through this mechanism, protecting against the kind of low-grade systemic inflammation linked to nearly every chronic modern disease. Number 6. Dates, the fruit built for the far end of your colon. The date palm is mentioned more than any other fruit tree in biblical literature, and dates were used historically to produce date honey, the primary sweetener of the ancient Levant. What makes dates remarkable is their dense, slow-fermenting fiber, which stays largely intact until it reaches the most distal section of your large intestine, the part that often receives the least nutritional support from a typical modern diet. There, dates feed diverse anaerobic bacterial communities that produce a steady, sustained release of short-chain fatty acids, lowering the colon's pH and creating an environment that's inhospitable to harmful bacteria. Population studies have linked consistent date consumption with reduced rates of colonic and digestive cancers, an effect researchers attribute to ongoing free radical clearance in exactly the part of the gut most other foods never reach. Number 5. Bitter herbs, the Passover ritual that's secretly a prebiotic protocol. Bitter herbs are mandated in the Passover ritual as a symbol of historical hardship, but plants like chicory, represented in that bitter herb tradition, contain remarkable concentrations of inulin, between 15 and 20% by weight. Inulin cannot be broken down by human digestive enzymes at all. It passes completely undigested into your colon. But here's what's genuinely sophisticated about how it's structured in the raw plant. The inulin stays physically trapped inside the plant's cell walls, so as your gut bacteria slowly break down those outer cell walls, the inulin releases gradually throughout your entire colon rather than all at once, avoiding the bloating and gas that comes from concentrated, isolated fiber supplements. This slow release specifically feeds Bifidobacterium longum and a butyrate-producing bacterium called Anaerostipes hadrus, building what researchers call a trophic chain, one bacterial population feeding the next, all the way down your digestive tract. If you're realizing how much actual molecular precision is buried inside foods most people think of as purely symbolic, hit the like button now, because we still have 6 more on this list, and they only get more interesting from here. Number 4. Alliums, garlic and onion as documented antimicrobials. When the Israelites wandered the wilderness, they specifically mourned the garlic and onions of Egypt, and once you understand what these foods actually contain, that grief makes complete sense. Garlic and onion both contain fructooligosaccharides and organosulfur compounds that researchers have found selectively proliferate beneficial bifidobacterium and lactobacillus populations in the gut. At the same time, these same compounds exert documented bactericidal activity, specifically against harmful gut pathogens, attacking the bad bacteria while feeding the beneficial ones simultaneously. Egyptian medical texts catalog garlic in over 20 separate medicinal preparations. That wasn't superstition, it was generations of observed outcomes, and modern research keeps confirming the mechanism behind every single one of them. Number 3. Flaxseed, the seed your gut transforms into hormone protection. Flaxseed contains a compound called secoisolarysaresinol diglucoside, and like the pomegranate compound we discussed earlier, this one requires your gut bacteria to unlock its full potential. Specific gut microbes convert it into mammalian lignans called enterodiol and enterolactone, compounds researchers have studied for their role in hormonal balance. Flaxseed also forms a mucilage gel, as it absorbs water in your digestive tract, physically coating and protecting your intestinal lining while lowering circulating cholesterol levels. This is a seed where the raw ingredient and the active compound are almost 2 different substances entirely, separated only by what your own gut does to it. Number 2. Raw honey, the food that disrupts bacterial biofilms. Honey appears throughout Scripture as a symbol of strength and abundance, and raw, unprocessed honey contains non-digestible oligosaccharides that proliferate beneficial bifidobacteria in the gut. But honey's most striking documented effect is against Helicobacter pylori, the bacterium responsible for most stomach ulcers. Research has found raw honey actively disrupts the protective biofilms this pathogen builds around itself, while simultaneously downregulating the inflammatory signaling pathway it triggers in the stomach lining. The critical detail is that this only applies to raw, unheated honey. Once honey is heated and filtered the way most commercial products are processed, the enzymes responsible for these effects are largely destroyed. Number 1. Pomegranate, wheat, barley, grapes, figs, olives, and dates. The 7 species as a single system. And here we arrive at the one that ties everything together. In Deuteronomy 8:8, God doesn't describe the promised land in vague terms of abundance. He lists 7 specific foods by name: wheat, barley, grapes, figs, pomegranates, olives, and dates. For centuries, this was read purely as evidence of agricultural fertility. But when researchers analyze these 7 foods together as a single nutritional system, rather than 7 separate items, something genuinely remarkable emerges. The grains supply complementary proteins and slow-burning fiber. The grapes trigger that specific beneficial bacterial bloom we discussed. The figs thicken the gut's protective mucus lining. The pomegranates, once transformed by gut bacteria, repair the intestinal barrier at a cellular level. The olives deliver fat-soluble compounds that make every other nutrient in this list more bioavailable, while simultaneously fighting inflammation directly. and the dates feed the most distal, often neglected part of the colon. Each food in this list appears to compensate for exactly what the others lack. Researchers describe finding effects that are greater than what any single ingredient could produce alone, a level of nutritional completeness that's difficult to read as coincidence. This content is for historical and educational purposes only. Always consult a qualified healthcare professional before making changes to your diet or health routine. 12 foods, thousands of years of observation, and modern microbiome science arriving, study after study, at conclusions the ancient world had already quietly built into their daily meals, their rituals, and their most sacred texts. If you got something out of this, drop a comment and tell me which one surprised you most. Hit subscribe, because we're just getting started uncovering what was hiding in plain sight the entire time.